The rain hardened into needles as Evan Cole said, "Not tonight," and the truck shivered across the black lane like a horse that smelled fire. The guardrail reared, and glass beads lifted, spinning like a slow galaxy that forgot gravity. Evan said, "Hold the line," as the wheel kicked, and his chest answered with a hollow drum he pretended was courage. A man of light sat where no one sat, and Gabriel said, "Grace has called your name 3 times, Evan Cole." Evan said, "I don't answer unknown numbers," and the shade perched on the dashboard and hissed, "Let it all go." Sirens were far and red, as Lena's warning in his voicemail, and he lied, "I'm fine," while blood warmed his brow. Gabriel said, "You will be whole when you stop ignoring what loves you," and Evan said, "I don't need rescue." The truck kissed steel, folded, and set him free onto wet concrete, and he crawled out with the cross burning in his pocket. The shade stretched tall and whispered, "Stay numb." And the rain applauded the lie. Evan said, "I hear nothing," but the name inside him rang like a bell underwater. Under fluorescents that always feel like 3 a.m., Dr. Lena Hart said, "You're lucky," and Evan said, "Luck is a poor medic." She irrigated his cut, and the sting argued with the silence he carried like a locked safe. Lena said, "Describe any visions," and Evan said, "I saw a warning in the rain." She said, "Concussions can stage plays," and he answered, "So can consciences." A nurse laughed down the hall, and the sound felt foreign, like summer at a funeral. Evan hid the silver cross in his fist, and his pulse thudded against it like a prisoner tapping code. Lena said, "Hallucinations aren't holy," and he said, "Pain is not proof either." The shade slid across the monitor reflection and whispered, "Call it stress," and he blinked hard. Lena said, "Rest or risk a second crash," and Evan said, "Headlines don't nap." She sighed, "Trauma looks for myths," and he said, "Maybe myths look for me." As the room exhaled a sterile chill that could not cool what burned inside. Pastor Miriam Hale waited by the sliding doors with a dented thermos and a gaze that sifted truth from smoke, and she said, "Grace doesn't shout forever." Evan said, "Then it should learn to," while the rain thinned to a mist that felt like breath on the skin. She pressed the thermos into his hands and said, "Drink before you answer yourself." Evan said, "I am answering fine," and the words tasted like metal. The shade lounged on the awning and murmured, "You're fine as you are," and he almost nodded. Miriam said, "That lie is older than your scars," and the parking lot hummed like a quiet organ. Evan said, "A voice called me by name," and she said, "Then your name is safer than you think." He laughed without humor and asked, "Why keep calling me?" She said, "Because you keep running," and the automatic doors parted behind them like a gentle command he did not obey. Marcus Bell found him by the humming vending machines and said, "I used to ignore it too," and Evan said, "You found better than numb." Marcus tapped a bronze chip and said, "I found someone who wouldn't let go." The machines chimed like small gods asking for coins, and Evan smirked to hide how his hands shook. The shade draped itself over a soda logo and purred, "Confession is theater," and Marcus answered the air, "And cynicism is a cage." Evan said, "I don't want pity," and Marcus said, "Good, I don't have any, just a spare hand." He placed the chip in Evan's palm, and it felt heavier than metal. Evan said, "I don't deserve help," and Marcus said, "Grace bargains with need, not merit." Somewhere a code blue paged, and silence fell back like a curtain. Evan said, "If I say yes, what changes?" and Marcus said, "You." Back in his small apartment, Evan unpacked gear like a priest laying out relics, and he said, "I don't accept gifts from strangers." The silver cross turned up in a pocket he never remembered stitching, and his breath shortened. Gabriel's voice passed through the room like wind over a bottle and said, "Grace isn't a stranger. It is your name," said rightly. Evan said, "Then mispronounce me," and the shade along the window curved into a smile he refused to see. Childhood hymns rose like wood smoke, stinging and sweet, and he opened the window to let them out. The rain had thinned to ticking, and the city muttered its late rites below. Evan said, "If I answer, what do I lose?" And Gabriel said, "Only what is killing you." He closed the window on the word, and stood in the hush that followed. The cross felt heavier, like a promise that expected to be kept. Dawn steamed off the wreck like breath from a sleeping animal, as Evan Cole framed a bent fender, and said, "Headlines pay rent." Dr. Lena Hart called and said, "Headaches mean rest," and he answered, "Deadlines don't nap." The shutter clapped like a gavel that kept finding him guilty. A woman sobbed by the guardrail, and the sound cracked something he had boarded shut. The shade slid along the chrome and purred, "Misery pays better than mercy." Evan said, "I only tell the truth," and the words tasted like cold nails. Gabriel was nowhere, which felt louder than thunder, and he muttered, "I didn't need you anyway." Sirens braided into traffic, and the sky stayed the color of regret. Lena said, "You're not invincible." And he said, "I am employed," while his hands shook a private verdict. He lowered the camera and whispered, "Help," but only the wind replied. Pastor Miriam Hale said, "Sit anywhere," and Evan said, "Anywhere is far enough," as the church basement hummed under a halo of thrifted string lights. Folding chairs made a ring that felt like a small moon of listening. "Hush," Marcus Bell said. "I stole my mother's pearls," and the room held him with its hands down. The shade lounged on the coffee urn and whispered, "Confession is theater with cheaper seats." Evan said, "I don't audition," while his chest kept time with a drum he did not own. Miriam said, "Grace sits where you sit," and he said, "Then it is late." A woman across the circle said, "I forgave a ghost," and the air changed weight. Evan stared at the floor and saw his reflection in a puddle of mop water. He said, "A voice called my name," and Miriam said, "Then answer softly." He stayed silent, which sounded like yes to the ache. After the circle, the hall smelled like old hymnals and soap, and Marcus said, "How did it feel to almost say yes?" Evan said, like stepping toward a cliff and finding a mirror. Marcus said, "Mercy is a net, not a drop." Evan said, "Weakness wears soft shoes," and Gabriel ghosted across a window as a faint sun in clouded glass. The shade traced a fingertip through the condensation and drew a door he would not open. Marcus said, "I asked for help and woke up breathing," and Evan said, "I prefer proof." Gabriel whispered, "Strength is learning to be held," and he blinked like someone who had swallowed light wrong. A janitor's cart squeaked a benediction down the corridor. Evan said, "What if I lose myself?" And Marcus said, "Maybe you lose the weight you mistake for self." He pocketed the cross and pretended it wasn't burning. They met at a corner cafe where the barista wrote scriptures in foam without knowing, and Lena said, "You are making each other worse." Marcus smiled and said, "Or better." Evan said, "I am not a charity case," and the shade curled around his mug like obedient steam. Lena said, "Trauma can cosplay revelation," and he said, "So can resignation." A violin on the speaker tried to talk them into gentleness, and failed only a little. Marcus said, "Grace is stubborn," and Lena said, "So is denial." Evan stared at the door like a fire exit he was afraid to use. He said, "If I open, what enters?" And Lena said, "Air," while Marcus said, "Life." The bell over the door chimed like a tiny altar agreeing with both of them. Evan lifted the cup and tasted warmth he could not mock. Twilight thinned the rain to silver threads as a street preacher lifted a cardboard sign that read, "Turn and live." Evan said, "Selling lightning," and the man said, "Son, you already got struck." The shade chuckled and said, "He doesn't know you." And Evan said, "No one does." Traffic sighed like tired lungs, and the neon pharmacy cross blinked a soft amen. The preacher said, "You keep walking with your wound like it pays rent," and Evan said, "It covers utilities." The man's eyes softened and he said, "Grace pays the whole bill," and Evan looked away before the price sounded fair. He touched the cross in his pocket like a coin he hated to spend. The wind slid under his collar and spelled his name without letters. He said, "Maybe tomorrow," and the sky said nothing, which felt like yes. Before dawn, Evan dreamed a hallway that never ended, and a belt that cracked like dry thunder. He said, "Get out of me," as small boots thudded toward a door with his name carved wrong. The room smelled of old soap, wet wool, and fear that learned to whisper. His mother's silence sat beside the bed like furniture that never moved. Gabriel said, "I want to get you out of you," and the voice felt like water finding stone. The shade perched on the bed frame and cooed, "Pain is familiar, keep it close." Evan said, "Familiar beats emptiness," and the hallway squeezed tighter. Lightning leaked around the curtains, and the cross tangled in his fingers like a startled fish. Gabriel said, "Open your hand," and the metal warmed as if it remembered daylight. The shade said, "Clench harder," and the old belt lifted itself from memory like a black river. Evan said, "I am tired of being braver than I am," and his eyes flooded without permission. He woke to blinds striping the blue room, whispering, "Help," to air that finally answered back with breath. Morning laid a milk-white sheet over the parsonage table as Pastor Miriam poured tea that smelled like rescue. She said, "Name the house," and Evan said, "The one where love cost bruises." Steam braided the air, and his hands hovered like shy birds over the cup. Miriam said, "Grace is not permission, it is rescue," and the word rescue rang hollow and brave. Evan said, "I don't deserve a boat," and the cup trembled, tapping porcelain like a small bell. The shade lounged in the window reflection and murmured, "Drown, pretty." Gabriel stood in the doorway like weather that finally broke and said, "Take the rope." Evan said, "I unlearn slow," and Miriam smiled. "Then we will practice patience." He spoke the map of the old hallway, the belt, the silence that grew teeth. Miriam said, "You are not what happened. You are what you accept." And he looked down at the cross. He said, "If I accept mercy, what happens to justice?" And she answered, "They meet at the place you stand." He lifted the cup and found it warm enough to thaw a winter he pretended was weather. The radiology monitor glowed like a winter moon as Dr. Lena Hart clicked through clean slices of Evan's head. She said, "No bleed, no tumor, just bruised noise." And he said, "Noise is my genre." She folded her arms and said, "You are not broken beyond repair." The shade lounged in the black of the screen and whispered, "But you are beyond worth." Evan said, "What is worth but receipt and signature?" And Lena frowned at the metaphor like a bad lab value. She said, "Sleep, hydrate, stop chasing wrecks for 1 week." And he said, "Rent arrives regardless." Gabriel stood by the eye chart like a silent nurse and said, "Rest is obedience, not laziness." Lena rubbed her brow and said, "I can treat the brain. The heart is outside my license." Evan said, "The heart is outside my lease," and tried a smile that did not pay out. The room waited like a held breath, and the cross in his pocket tapped time against his thigh. Lena said, "Come back if the lights go sideways," and he said, "They already did," and they spoke. She stared at him, then said, "Bring whoever talks to your follow-up," and he said, "He prefers alleys and weather." Marcus marched Evan into the community kitchen, where onions and soap braided the smell of redemption. He said, "Serve first, feel later," and Evan said, "I feel nothing." Steam rose from the soup kettles like soft sermons, and ladles clinked like small bells. The shade skated along a stainless counter and hissed, "Hide in work, it counts as virtue." Gabriel said, "Work becomes worship when love is the object," and Evan pretended not to hear. A child stepped up with a crayon drawing of a lighthouse and said, "This finds people at night." Evan said, "I used to find wrecks," and the child shrugged, "Maybe look for boats." Marcus laughed and said, "Out of the mouths of babes," and handed him a stack of bowls. Evan's hands remembered gentleness and forgot proof for an entire minute. He said, "What if I am only useful with a camera?" And Marcus said, then pointed at Mercy. The cross warmed as he ladled soup, and 1,000 quiet hungers lifted toward the light. He blinked hard, discovering tears are not a defect in the lens. The room answered with a softness he had never hired. Night stitched the apartment together with thread too thin to see, and the shade sat at the foot of the bed. It said, "You are a fraud," and Evan said, "I know." Gabriel stood by the window like a quiet dawn and said, "You are beloved." Evan said, "Beloveds don't break things," and the word broke in his mouth. Traffic hummed a gray lullaby, and the cross weighed his palm like a sealed letter. The shade said, "Open to nothing," and Gabriel said, "Open to love." Evan said, "If I open, will I drown?" And Gabriel said, "You will breathe." He remembered the belt, the silence, and the photographs that paid him in frost. He said, "I am tired of hiring doubt as my bodyguard." And the room held still. Gabriel said, "Speak the name that called you," and Evan whispered, "Grace." The shade shrank like smoke with nothing to cling to, and slid under the bed. Evan lay back and let his ribs move like doors, learning to breathe as if it were prayer. Outside, a siren faded like a question that had found its answer. He said, "I will try to answer when it calls," and the night agreed. Late sun cut gold bars across Miriam's office floor as she said, "When your mother died, I stood by her bed." Evan leaned forward, the thermos between his hands like a warm anchor. "Miriam said," she whispered, "tell Evan Grace will follow him until he turns around." Evan said, "She never said my name right." Miriam's eyes shone. "She did that day." The shade scratched invisible claws into the air, as if the truth offended it. Evan's breath caught, the memory clicking into place like a key meeting its lock. He said, "She sent you?" Miriam nodded, the silver cross at her neck catching the light. Gabriel's presence brushed the room like a soft wind. "She knew the road would be long," Miriam said. Evan swallowed hard, tasting metal. "I thought she'd forgotten me." Miriam said, "She asked me to wait until you could hear." The air thickened with something heavier than grief and lighter than air. Evan whispered, "I hear." Rainwater mirrored the sky in the alley's puddles, as Gabriel said, "Your mother asked for me." Evan kept his hands deep in his jacket. "I asked for no one." Gabriel's eyes softened. "You asked every time you photographed pain and called it truth." The shade slithered along the brickwork, grinning. "He profits from wounds." Evan's voice caught. "I was trying to tell the truth." Gabriel stepped closer, linen damp, halo refracted in the water between them. "Which truth, Evan?" The wind teased at his collar, smelling of wet stone and old prayers. He glanced down and saw his reflection layered with Gabriel's light. "I thought it was mine," he said. "You have been living in half-light," Gabriel replied. The distant hum of traffic felt like a held breath. Evan said, "What if I can't tell the difference?" Gabriel's voice was steady as a church bell. "Then you ask." Lena appeared at the alley mouth, umbrella forgotten. "I'll believe in miracles when one stitches a severed artery." Gabriel turned. "I did." She frowned. "When?" His voice was gentle. "When you were 16, bleeding, praying to a God you no longer believe in." Her face cracked open, a shell giving way to light. Rain pattered like applause no one wanted to hear. Evan looked between them, the air feeling suddenly electric. The shade crouched in the shadow behind Lena, whispering, "Coincidence?" Her breath caught. "That night." Gabriel nodded, eyes steady. "You lived." The alley seemed to close around the three of them, the city muffled. Lena said nothing, jaw trembling. Evan whispered, "Now you believe." She didn't answer, but she didn't leave. On a park bench slick with dew, Marcus said, "I stole the pearls to buy dope for both of us." Evan flinched. "I pretended it was a joke." Marcus looked down, voice steady. "Grace forgave me, will you?" The shade perched on the bench arm, sneering, "Keep the debt alive." Evan stared at the wet grass, fingers curling. "I don't know how to forgive." Gabriel's voice cut through the mist. "Start by not rehearsing the wound." Marcus's hand was open between them, palm steady. Evan's eyes burned, the air damp against his skin. "I'll try," he said, barely audible. The shade hissed, shrinking slightly. Marcus nodded. "That's enough for today." Miriam set a small cassette on the desk, label faded, Evan Grace. She asked me to wait, she said. Evan's throat tightened. Play it. The tape hissed, then a young voice sang of being found in fields of loss. The shade paced the walls, shrinking. Gabriel stood behind Evan like a lighthouse, light steady. She didn't lose you, he said. She loaned you to mercy. Evan bent forward, sobs shaking him. Miriam's hand rested on his shoulder, grounding him. The hymn wound through the room like sunlight through old glass. Evan whispered, I thought I was abandoned. Miriam said, You were delivered. The shade dissolved into the corner shadow. Evan clutched the cross, tears falling onto the desk. Wind rattled the apartment windows like bones in a tin can as the shade loomed tall. You think you can start over? It said. Evan stood in the center of the room, photographs scattered at his feet. I think I can start, he answered. Headlines of his worst moments swirled in the air like vultures circling. The shade wrapped him in them, whispering, You are the sum of these failures. Evan's voice cracked. Help. Gabriel's light poured through the storm-dark glass. That is the truest prayer, he said. Miriam's name blinked on the phone, unanswered. Then Lena's. Thunder cracked as if to announce the moment. The cross burned hot in his palm. You don't belong anywhere, the shade hissed. I belong to the one who followed me here, Evan replied, though the words shook. A gust burst the curtains wide. The shadows flinched. The room felt smaller, but so did the dark. The door crashed open, and Lena stormed in, rain soaking her jacket. Say it again, she demanded. Evan's breath hitched. Help. She knelt beside him, her hand gripping his shoulder. I don't know your God, but I know CPR. Gabriel smiled faintly. Breath is borrowed grace, he said. The shade shrank back toward the corners, hissing at the word, help. You're not alone, Lena added, her voice a steel cable. The storm banged its fists on the windows but didn't get in. Evan's knees trembled under his weight, but he stayed standing. I can't promise I won't fall again, he told her. Then I'll help you up, she replied. Gabriel's gaze flickered between them like candlelight between hands. The cross in Evan's palm cooled to a steady, bearable warmth. I will answer when I'm called, he whispered, and Lena didn't ask who was calling. They sat in the sanctuary's front pew, candles guttering like tired sentinels. Evan said, I'm tired of making altars to doubt. Miriam nodded. Then dismantle them. Marcus added, brick by brick. The shade lingered near the choir loft, its form tattered. You'll miss me, it mocked. I will not, Evan said, the firmness in his voice surprising even him. Lena sat at the end of the pew, arms crossed but eyes softer than before. It doesn't end here, Miriam said. It never ends, Marcus countered with a smile. And that's the point. Evan exhaled, long and unshaken. The candles leaned toward him as if in agreement. Gabriel stood in the aisle, a lighthouse in human form, nodding once. The cross around Evan's neck caught a flicker of flame and held it. Gabriel's voice was quiet but unwavering. There is a thing you must return. Evan's brow furrowed. The pearls. Marcus shook his head. She's gone, Gabriel replied. Return them where you stole them, from your own story. Lena rolled her eyes. Metaphors. Evan stared at the old photograph of his mother in his hand. I've been holding on to more than pearls, he admitted. The shade slumped in the back like a shadow out of breath. Restitution, Gabriel said, is the language of grace. Evan nodded slowly. Then, I will speak it. Miriam smiled faintly, like someone recognizing the end of a long winter. The cross around his neck felt lighter, less like a burden, more like a compass. In his small studio, Evan spread out the stark photographs he'd taken over the years, wrecks, grief, eyes gone empty. I took without giving, he said. The shade clawed at each frame. Art is immoral. It spat. Mine won't be, Evan replied, sliding them into boxes labeled shelter auction. Gabriel stood near the door, watching like a witness signing a document. Now you are returning what you stole, he said. Evan's hands moved steadily, each print a confession wrapped in cardboard. I thought keeping them meant remembering, Evan said. Sometimes it means refusing to heal, Gabriel answered. The light through the window softened, turning the studio gold. Evan sealed the last box and stacked it by the door. The shade was nowhere to be seen. The community hall hummed with low conversation, as strings of warm light swayed overhead. The shade leaned near Lena, whispering, "Hell relapse, document it." Lena's pen paused. "I can document healing too." Evan stepped up to the mic, the crowd quieting. "I traded grace for proof," he said, voice steady. "Tonight, I trade proof for mercy." The words seemed to push the air outward, filling every corner. Gabriel stood near the back, his presence like sunrise in shadow. Marcus clapped once, breaking the stillness, and others followed. The shade hissed and slunk toward the exit, its ember eyes dimming. Evan gripped the mic, meeting eyes across the room. "This is not charity, it's return." The hall breathed as one. Bidding paddles rose like a forest of open hands. Marcus whispered, "This is what grace buys." Miriam smiled beside him. "And what it gives." The shade curled under a table, shivering in the glow of goodwill. Evan walked between bidders, answering questions about the prince, each explanation lighter than the last. A woman pressed his hand, saying, "You saw me in that photo." He nodded. "I see you now." The shade's form thinned until it was nothing but smoke, chasing the floorboards. Gabriel watched from the corner, nodding as if each paddle was another stone lifted from Evan's chest. The door slammed open, and a man staggered in, anger on his breath. "You profit on pain," he spat. Evan stepped forward. "I used to." The man's eyes burned. Gabriel murmured, "Don't defend, receive." Evan's voice softened. "I'm sorry." The man blinked, confusion cooling his rage. Murmurs rippled through the room, but no one moved to intervene. "You mean that?" the man asked. Evan nodded. "I mean that." The shade was nowhere, only the sound of the man's breathing, slowing like a storm losing wind. He lowered his gaze and turned away. Evan exhaled. The shade burst forth in its largest form yet, filling the rafters like storm clouds. "You belong to me," it roared. Evan lifted the cross high. "I belong to the one who followed me." Miriam, Marcus, and Lena joined hands, forming a circle around him. Gabriel's voice was steady. "Speak the name of your freedom." Evan's throat tightened, then opened. "Grace." The word rang like a struck bell, the shade unraveling into threads of smoke, pulled upward until nothing remained. The light in the hall seemed to swell, filling every shadow. As the light steadied, Lena murmured, "I can't chart that." Evan smiled. "You don't have to, just heal me when I fall." She nodded. "I can do that." Gabriel, already fading toward the exit, said, "Stop ignoring what loves you." Evan replied, "I will answer when it calls." The hum of conversation returned, gentle and low. Marcus clapped his shoulder, Miriam embraced him. The cross rested light against his chest, no longer a burden. Outside, the rain had stopped. The cemetery was damp with early morning dew, the grass breathing mist into the pale light. Evan knelt by his mother's headstone, the silver cross warm in his palm. "I turned around," he said quietly. Gabriel's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "I know." The shade was only a memory now, like an old cough finally gone silent. Evan laid the cross against the stone, fingers lingering on the cool granite. "Keep this for me until I'm finished," he murmured. Birds shifted in the nearby trees, their wings the only applause. The air smelled of rain and earth, grounding him in the moment. "You were right," he whispered. Grace waited. His breath felt light, unchained from the years of running. The sky brightened, soft and unhurried. The ER smelled of antiseptic and fresh coffee. Evan, camera slung at his side, moved between curtained bays, not as a scavenger but as a witness. Lena intercepted him with a clipboard. Try not to get in the way. He grinned. I'll try to get out of pain's way. He framed a grandmother cradling her newborn grandchild, the light pooling around them like a blessing. Lena paused nearby, watching his lens with an unfamiliar softness. Not every miracle needs proof, she said. But some deserve remembering, he replied. The shutter clicked, quiet as a heartbeat. Somewhere a monitor beeped, but no one rushed. This was a different kind of one where beginnings were louder than endings. The shelter smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. Marcus handed Evan a roller. This is the color of second chances, he said. Evan laughed. Roll it on thick. Miriam entered with a paper bag of sandwiches, smiling at the walls. Grace doesn't stain, it covers. Evan dipped the roller again, the pale color stretching over old marks. Then let it cover me, he said without irony. The shade was nowhere to be found. Only sunlight streamed in through dusty windows, making the air look gold. Marcus chuckled. You are learning. I'm painting, Evan corrected, but the truth was in the smile he didn't hide. The room felt bigger, and so did he. The circle met again in the church basement, chairs in the same uneven ring. Evan leaned forward. I used to chase proof. Now I practice gratitude. Lena smirked. I still need data. He grinned back. I still need grace. Miriam nodded. Both are truthful when they kneel. Marcus passed around steaming mugs of tea, the room humming like a hive at rest. Outside, rain tapped at the basement windows, uninvited, but harmless. Evan looked around the circle, realizing every face here had been part of his rescue. He didn't say thank you aloud. It was already in the air, breathing with them. The overpass where rain once tried to break him now lay under a clear sky. Evan stood at the railing, jacket open to the wind. I hear you, he said, the traffic below murmuring like a psalm in machine language. Gabriel's voice came from the quiet. Answer. Evan smiled. No hesitation. Yes. The single word echoed under the bridge long after he spoke it, like a bell still swinging after the rope is cut. He stayed until the light shifted from gold to blue, knowing he had nothing left to outrun.